My name is Brooke Harrington, and I just turned 68 last month. I built my construction company from nothing but calloused hands and determination, providing for my family for over 40 years. My son James became successful in finance, but with each promotion, I watched him change. When he invited me to a family dinner at that fancy restaurant, I thought maybe things were improving between us. Instead, I faced the ultimate betrayal that night. Before I tell you what happened when that $2,200 bill landed in front of me, let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to see how I handled that situation. I started working construction when I was 19 years old, carrying lumber and cleaning up job sites for minimum wage. Back then, my hands would bleed at the end of each day, but I never complained. That job was my ticket to building a future. I met Dorothy at a local diner where she waitressed nights while studying to be a teacher. We fell in love quickly, married young, and James came along just a year later. Those early years were tough. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment, Dorothy and I sleeping on a pull-out couch so James could have the bedroom. I would wake up at 4:30 every morning, put on my work boots, and head to whatever site we were building, working through rain, snow, and blistering heat. Dorothy would work evenings at the diner after teaching all day, so we could save every possible penny. We sacrificed everything for James. New clothes for us meant second-hand stores, but James always had proper fitting shoes and a warm winter coat. When our car broke down, I walked 3 miles each way to work for 6 months until we could afford repairs. But James never missed a day of school because of transportation issues. By the time James turned 10, I had learned enough about the construction business to start taking on small jobs of my own on weekends. Bathroom renovations, deck repairs, garage conversions. I would work 70 hours at my regular job, then another 20 on these side projects. Dorothy would help me with the bookkeeping after James went to bed. We would sit at our tiny kitchen table, counting every dollar, planning how to grow this little business. Dorothy was my rock through those difficult years. She believed in me when I doubted myself. When I finally saved enough to quit my job and start Harrington Construction officially, she framed our first business license and hung it proudly in our apartment. Those were wonderful years with James. Despite the financial struggles, I taught him to fish in the small creek behind our apartment complex. We would catch little sunfish, nothing worth keeping, but the look of joy on his face when he reeled one in made every moment precious. I never missed his Little League games, sometimes showing up still covered in drywall dust, but always there cheering from the bleachers. On Sundays, we would watch football together, James wearing a miniature version of my favorite team's jersey. When James was 19 and in his second year of college, Dorothy was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. She fought bravely for 14 months before passing. Those final days in the hospital, James showed the kind of character that made me proud. He would sit with his mother for hours, reading her favorite books, telling her about his classes, promising to make us proud. After Dorothy died, James and I grew even closer for a time. I had finally built Harrington Construction into a successful business with 30 employees. We specialized in custom homes and commercial renovations. The business provided enough income that I could pay for James to attend an Ivy League business school without loans. I wanted him to have the opportunities I never had, to start his adult life debt-free. I remember his graduation day so clearly, standing there watching him accept his diploma, thinking how proud Dorothy would have been. That night at dinner, James told me he had accepted a position with a prestigious financial firm in the city. I was so proud of him. First person in our family to graduate college, now working in a corner office. I thought all those years of sacrifice were worth it. The first few years of his career, James would call me almost daily. He would tell me about his projects, ask my advice about office politics, invite me to the city for dinner. I watched with fatherly pride as he climbed the corporate ladder, becoming one of the youngest vice presidents in his firm's history. Then James met Andrea during a corporate retreat. She came from money, old money as they say. Her father was a federal judge, her mother from a banking family. Andrea was a successful corporate lawyer herself. Beautiful, educated, polished in ways that made me feel awkward and rough around the edges whenever we met. Their wedding was my first glimpse of how things would change. It was held at her parents' country club, an affair with 300 guests, most of whom I had never met. I felt out of place in my new suit, which Andrea's mother commented looked off the rack. It was, of course. I remember trying to make conversation with Andrea's father about fishing, one of my favorite pastimes, only to learn he meant fly fishing in private Montana streams, not the kind I enjoyed. After the wedding, I started noticing subtle changes in James. Our calls became less frequent. He began dropping casual comments about my behavior or appearance. Little things, like suggesting I upgrade my 15-year-old pickup truck since I could afford to, or mentioning that I should consider moving to a better neighborhood, though I loved the home where James had grown up, where Dorothy and I had built our life. I tried to maintain our relationship. I would invite James and Andrea for Sunday dinners, offering to cook Dorothy's recipes that James had always loved. The first few times they came, but Andrea would barely touch the food. Eventually, the excuses started. They were too busy. They had other engagements. The drive was too long. I told myself to be understanding. My son had married into a different world. He was building his own life. But deep down, I knew something more troubling was happening. The son who once proudly introduced me to his college friends was slowly becoming embarrassed by his blue-collar father. After their first anniversary, James and Andrea bought a home in Oakwood Estates, one of those gated communities with manicured lawns and houses that all look slightly different versions of the same design. The first time I visited, I had to stop at a guardhouse and have my ID checked before being allowed in. The guard looked skeptically at my truck, asking twice if I was sure I had the right address. Invitations to their home became rare events. Thanksgiving the first year, Christmas the next. Each visit felt increasingly uncomfortable. Andrea would give me tours of their latest renovations, casually mentioning costs that exceeded what most people in my neighborhood earned in a year. James would show off his wine collection, his home theater, his imported furniture, as if these possessions were extensions of himself. After Dorothy passed, I had gotten used to a quiet life. I had my work, my few close friends, my modest hobbies. But as James pulled away, the loneliness began to feel heavier. I would find myself driving by his old school, remembering when he was small enough to ride on my shoulders. I kept his bedroom exactly as it was when he left for college, sometimes sitting there when the house felt too empty. I tried reaching out to build a relationship with my grandchildren when they came along. Emma arrived first, then Tyler 2 years later. I would send handmade wooden toys for their birthdays, things I crafted in my garage workshop. For Christmas one year, I spent 3 months building Emma a dollhouse, recreating in miniature the first real home Dorothy and I had purchased. For Tyler, I made a train set with tracks that spelled his name. But my opportunities to see the grandkids were always controlled by Andrea. She had concerns about them visiting my neighborhood. She would mention allergies they supposedly had to my dog, Scout, though the children never sneezed when near him. When they did visit, Andrea would hover, quickly wiping their hands if they touched anything in my home. As the children grew, I noticed Andrea's subtle criticisms becoming more frequent. She would comment on my table manners, suggesting I needed to hold my fork differently. She would frown at my word choices or the way I pronounced certain things. Once, she corrected my grammar in front of the children, turning it into an educational moment about proper speech. James, who once defended me proudly, began to echo these criticisms. He suggested I update my wardrobe when meeting them in public. He would text before visits with reminders about topics to avoid, words not to use. The implicit message became clear. I was an embarrassment to the image they wanted to project. The most painful early incident happened during a dinner at their home when Tyler turned 7. It was a small gathering with a few other families from their neighborhood. When it came time for the meal, I discovered I had been seated at a small table in the corner with the youngest children, separated from the main dining table where James, Andrea, and their friends Saturday. James explained it as a space issue, but I saw the glances exchanged between him and Andrea. Despite my financial success with the construction company, I maintained a modest lifestyle. I kept my 3-bedroom ranch home in the working-class neighborhood where James grew up. I drove practical vehicles, took simple vacations, and saved most of what I earned. This wasn't from necessity but choice. Dorothy and I had always valued simplicity and authenticity over showing off. As James climbed higher in his financial career, his obsession with appearances and social status seemed to consume him. He joined the right clubs, attended the right charity events, associated with people he thought could further his ambitions. Andrea encouraged this, having grown up understanding the currency of social connections. What James didn't know was that I had sold Harrington Construction 2 years earlier for a sum that would have impressed even his wealthy in-laws. After 40 years of building the business, a large development corporation made an offer I couldn't refuse. But I kept this private, depositing the money and living exactly as I always had. I wanted relationships based on love and respect, not financial interest. Each time I tried to connect with my grandchildren, Andrea found reasons to interfere. Emma's ballet lessons conflicted with my suggested visit times. Tyler's soccer practice couldn't be missed. Their schedule was always too full for Grandpa. I would send texts, asking about school events I could attend, only to be told they had already invited Andrea's parents. As the distance grew, James became increasingly critical of my life choices. He questioned why I still mowed my own lawn when I could hire someone. He suggested my hobby of refurbishing old furniture was embarrassing when I could afford new pieces. Every aspect of my authentic self seemed to become something he wanted hidden away like an old family secret. The phone call from James came on a Tuesday evening in April. I was in my workshop, sanding down an old rocking chair I had found at a garage sale, when my cell phone rang. Seeing James's name on the screen surprised me, as our communications had become limited to occasional text messages and obligatory holiday calls. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked about my health, my recent activities, seeming genuinely interested for the first time in years. Then came the invitation that made my heart leap. A special family dinner that Saturday at Le Chateau, one of those French restaurants where they don't put prices on the menu. James explained that they wanted to celebrate some good news, and specifically wanted me there. He mentioned the grandchildren had been asking about me, and Andrea had suggested including me in this important family gathering. I felt a rush of hope that perhaps things were changing, that my son was finally remembering the bond we once shared. After hanging up, I sat in my workshop, emotions washing over me. Maybe they had finally realized that fancy houses and expensive cars weren't what made a family. Maybe James was remembering the values Dorothy and I had tried to instill in him. I allowed myself to imagine a reconciliation, a return to the warm relationship we once had. The next morning, I drove to Millerton Mall, a place I rarely visited, to shop for something appropriate to wear to such an upscale restaurant. The saleswoman at the department store helped me select a charcoal gray suit that fit better than anything I had owned before. I splurged on a new blue tie that she said brought out my eyes, thinking of how I wanted to make a good impression on my grandchildren. Friday afternoon, I got a haircut at Tony's barbershop, where I had been going for 30 years. Tony noticed my elevated mood and asked what the occasion was. When I told him about the dinner with James and his family, he seemed genuinely happy for me, though I caught a look of concern cross his face briefly. As I sat in the barber chair, I remembered teaching James to ride his first bicycle. He had been so determined, getting back up after each fall, refusing my help until he finally mastered it. His triumphant smile when he pedaled down the sidewalk without falling still warmed my heart decades later. I hope to see that genuine smile again at dinner. That evening, I called my friend Harold, who had worked for me at Harrington Construction for 25 years before retiring. Harold was one of the few people who knew about my financial situation and had witnessed the gradual estrangement from James. He listened patiently as I described the invitation and my hopes for reconciliation. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a moment before speaking. He gently suggested I consider James's motivations for the sudden invitation. Was there a reason beyond family connection? Harold reminded me of past disappointments, times when I had gotten my hopes up only to feel more isolated afterward. I dismissed Harold's concerns, preferring to focus on the positive possibilities. This dinner could be the beginning of healing our relationship. Perhaps Andrea had softened her views about me. Maybe the grandchildren had been insisting on seeing their grandfather. I fell asleep that night filled with optimistic scenarios of family reunification. Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather. I spent the morning carefully pressing my new suit, shining my shoes, and even practicing what I might say to Emma and Tyler. I had missed so much of their lives and was eager to hear about their interests, their schools, their friends. While driving to the restaurant, I rehearsed conversation topics that might impress Andrea. I had read about a legal case in the newspaper that related to her field of practice. I had researched the private school the children attended so I could ask informed questions. I wanted so badly to fit into their world, if only for this dinner. I arrived at Le Chateau 30 minutes early, too anxious to wait at home any longer. The restaurant was housed in a converted mansion from the 19th century, with valet parking and doormen in formal uniforms. I chose to park my own car, not comfortable with strangers driving my reliable old Ford. Walking through the parking lot, I noticed the luxury vehicles that surrounded my modest truck. Bentleys, Mercedes, even a Rolls-Royce gleamed in the evening Sunday. I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach but pushed it away. Tonight wasn't about cars or appearances, it was about family. The restaurant's interior was opulent, in a way that made me immediately uncomfortable. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, oil paintings in ornate frames adorned the walls, and staff in formal attire moved quietly among tables covered in crisp white linens. The maitre d' raised an eyebrow slightly when I gave James's name for the reservation. As I waited in the lobby, memories of family meals when James was young flooded my mind. Dorothy making her famous meatloaf, James telling animated stories about school, the three of us laughing together at our kitchen table. Those simple dinners contained more joy than any meal in a fancy restaurant could provide. James and his family arrived 20 minutes late. Through the restaurant's front windows, I watched them exit their black BMW, Andrea adjusting Emma's dress and smoothing Tyler's hair before they entered. James was checking his phone, barely looking up as they walked inside. The greeting was brief and cold. James gave me a quick handshake. Andrea offered a perfunctory cheek kiss, and the children, now 9 and 7, gave reluctant hugs clearly at their parents' insistence. Emma looked at me with curiosity, perhaps trying to reconcile this stranger with vague memories of a grandfather. Tyler seemed more interested in the elaborate fish tank near the entrance. The maitre d' led us not to a small family table as I had expected, but to a large round table in the center of the dining room where 6 other adults were already seated. James quickly introduced them as business associates and their spouses, people whose names I immediately forgot as anxiety began to build in my chest. This wasn't a family dinner at all. I was seated between a woman in an expensive-looking dress who introduced herself as the wife of someone important at James's firm, and an empty chair that I later learned was being held for another business associate who was running late. James sat across the table, with Andrea beside him, and the children were placed at the opposite side, too far for any meaningful interaction. My attempts to engage with Emma and Tyler were repeatedly blocked by Andrea, who would interject with reminders about their manners or redirect their attention to the children of James's colleagues. When I asked Emma about school, Andrea answered for her, explaining the prestigious curriculum to the table, rather than allowing her daughter to speak to her grandfather. James spent the entire first course discussing investment opportunities with his colleagues, occasionally including their wives in the conversation, but never once drawing me in. I sat awkwardly, feeling increasingly invisible, picking at an appetizer I couldn't pronounce and didn't particularly enjoy. Andrea made sure everyone at the table knew of her family connections, dropping her father the judge's name several times and mentioning her mother's involvement with exclusive charity organizations. When conversation briefly turned to homes, she described their recent kitchen renovation, casually mentioning a cost that exceeded what most people in my neighborhood earned in a year. I noticed Andrea making comments about my appearance to the woman beside her, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough that I couldn't hear references to my suit being off the rack and my haircut being unfashionable. James, who once would have defended me fiercely, pretended not to notice his wife's behavior. The conversation flowed around me as if I were a rock in a stream, present but not affecting the current. They discussed vacation homes, private schools, investment portfolios, all topics that excluded me by their nature. When I tried to contribute a comment about a business news story I had read, James quickly redirected the conversation before I could finish my thought. Without consulting me, James ordered wine for the table, an expensive French vintage that the sommelier presented with great ceremony. When the wine was poured, I noticed my glass was filled last and with noticeably less than the others. The subtle message of my lesser status at this table was becoming increasingly clear. My discomfort grew as I realized I had been invited not as valued family but as an afterthought, perhaps to create the appearance of family unity for James's business associates. The realization settled like a weight in my stomach, making the elaborate food taste like ashes in my mouth. The turning point came an hour into this uncomfortable dinner. A man in an expensive suit approached the table, and James immediately stood to greet him with enthusiasm. This was clearly someone James wanted to impress, someone important to his business aspirations. The newcomer glanced at the table, noting there were no empty seats except the one beside me. Before the man could speak, James looked directly at me and said, in a clear, dismissive tone, "Dad, this table is for the family. You can wait outside." The words hung in the air for a moment before several people at the table laughed, taking it as a joke, though the intention behind it was unmistakable. I felt blood rush to my face as everyone at the table turned to look at me. The businessman raised an eyebrow, seeming uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to intervene. Andrea smiled tightly, her expression suggesting she agreed with James's assessment that I didn't belong. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. My own son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was publicly humiliating me to impress a business connection. In that moment, I saw clearly how James now viewed me. Not as his father who had loved and supported him through everything, but as an embarrassing reminder of humble origins he wanted to forget. Restaurant patrons at nearby tables had heard James's comment and were staring, some with disapproval, others with the morbid curiosity of witnesses to a car accident. I sat frozen in my chair, decades of paternal love colliding with this moment of ultimate rejection. James, perhaps realizing how his comment had been received, attempted to soften it with a forced laugh. "Or you could sit at the bar, Dad. Might be more comfortable for you there." This suggestion, delivered with a condescending smile, only deepened the humiliation. Andrea's expression contained no embarrassment, only a smug satisfaction that confirmed she had likely encouraged this behavior. My grandchildren watched this interaction with confused expressions, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the wrongness of it. Though every instinct told me to leave immediately, some stubborn part of me refused to give James the satisfaction. I stayed in my seat, silent and dignified despite the burning shame. The businessman was eventually seated at a small table brought by the staff, but the damage was already done. The meal continued in excruciating slowness. James ordered more and more extravagant dishes for the table, rare seafood, expensive cuts of meat, specialty desserts flown in from other countries. Each order felt like a performance for his business associates, a demonstration of wealth and sophistication that required my humiliation as a contrasting backdrop. Throughout the meal, I caught Tyler looking at me with confusion in his eyes, perhaps trying to reconcile the grandfather he barely knew with the man his father treated so dismissively. Emma avoided looking at me entirely, already learning the family skill of pretending uncomfortable things weren't happening. After 3 agonizing hours, as coffee and dessert were being finished, the waiter approached with a leather folder containing the bill. With a flourish that suggested prior arrangement, he placed it directly in front of me. I opened it to find a total of $2,200 for a meal that had provided nothing but bitter memories. James looked at me expectantly from across the table, his expression making it clear he assumed I would pay this extravagant sum. The table fell silent as everyone watched to see what the discarded father would do. In that moment, I understood completely. This hadn't been an olive branch. It had been a transaction. James had invited me because he expected me to foot the bill for his business entertaining. As I stared at the exorbitant bill, a lifetime of memories flashed through my mind. I remembered working through a severe case of pneumonia to complete a construction job that would pay for James's braces. I recalled selling my beloved fishing boat to cover the deposit for his college apartment. Every sacrifice, every moment of putting his needs before my own, had led to this moment of ultimate disrespect. I closed the leather folder slowly, my weathered hands steadier than I felt inside. The table remained silent, all eyes on me as they waited for me to fulfill my expected role. James wore a slight smile, confident in his power over the father who had never denied him anything. In the tense silence, I noticed Emma watching me with a troubled expression. Despite her young age, something in her eyes suggested she recognized the wrongness of what was happening. Tyler fidgeted in his seat, looking between his father and me with confusion. These children were witnessing how their father treated his father, absorbing a lesson about family values I had never wanted to teach them. With deliberate calmness that masked the storm inside me, I slid the bill back across the white tablecloth toward James. I maintained eye contact with my son as I did this, my silence speaking volumes about the line that had been crossed. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor in the now quiet section of the restaurant. Every person at the table watched as I buttoned my new suit jacket and straightened my posture to my full height. For the first time that evening, I commanded the space around me. "I have something to say to all of you," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion behind it. 49 years ago, I held my son James for the first time and promised him I would always provide for him, protect him, and teach him what matters in life. I worked my fingers to the bone to keep that promise. I looked directly at James, whose smug expression had faltered. "What you don't know, son, is that I sold Harrington Construction 2 years ago for $27 million. I never told you because I wanted to be certain you valued me as your father, not as a bank account. Tonight has given me that clarity." A collective gasp went around the table. Andrea's face drained of color, and James's business associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The power dynamic had suddenly and irreversibly changed. "I never needed a fancy house or expensive car to feel successful," I continued. "True success is raising a child with character, integrity, and gratitude. By that measure, I have failed completely." I turned my attention to my grandchildren, softening my tone. "Emma and Tyler, I want you to know that wealth without character is poverty of the worst kind. Your grandfather has always been wealthy in the ways that matter, even when I had nothing in my bank account. I hope someday you'll understand that." Returning my gaze to James, I reached into my wallet and placed $80 on the table. "This covers my portion of the meal, which is all I'm responsible for. I refuse to pay for the company of people who don't respect me." James had gone pale, his carefully constructed image crumbling before his business associates. Andrea placed her hand on his arm, whispering urgently in his ear, no doubt calculating how this revelation of my wealth might benefit them if they could repair the damage. "Brooke, wait," James stammered, using my first name as he often did now, another small erasure of our relationship. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was just joking earlier." "No misunderstanding, James. For years, I've watched you become ashamed of me, of your upbringing, of everything your mother and I taught you. Tonight was simply the final confirmation of what I've tried to deny. You value status over family, appearances over substance. That's your choice to make, but I don't have to finance it." With that, I turned and walked toward the exit, feeling dozens of eyes on my back but maintaining my dignity with every step. The maitre nodded respectfully as I passed, perhaps having witnessed similar family dramas play out in this setting of wealth and pretension. As I pushed through the heavy front doors into the cool evening air, the restaurant manager followed me out. "Sir," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for what happened in there. No one should be treated that way, especially by family." I thanked him for his kindness, the simple human acknowledgement nearly bringing tears to my eyes after hours of invisibility. As we spoke briefly, I noticed James watching through the restaurant window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When I reached my truck in the far corner of the parking lot, the final humiliation of the evening awaited me. The engine refused to turn over, making only a clicking sound that indicated a dead battery. After 3 attempts, I accepted that this was one indignity too many to overcome tonight. Rather than go back inside and face James and his associates, I locked the truck and began the 3-mile walk home in my new shoes that pinched with every step. The physical discomfort matched my emotional state, each step a reminder of the distance that had grown between my son and me. As I walked along the darkened road, cars occasionally passing me in a rush of air and light, I thought about calling James for a ride. My phone showed 3 missed calls from him already, but something in me had fundamentally changed. The father who had never said no, who had always been available regardless of personal cost, had finally reached his limit. I arrived home after midnight, feet blistered and heart heavy. The house I had once shared with Dorothy, where we had raised James with love, despite limited means, felt emptier than ever before. I sat in the dark living room for hours, confronting the full weight of what had happened. My son had not just rejected me, he had weaponized that rejection to impress others. There was no coming back from that kind of betrayal. By morning, my phone had accumulated 27 missed calls and 14 text messages from James. The first few texts were angry, accusing me of embarrassing him in front of important colleagues. By the 5th message, his tone had shifted to concern about how I had gotten home. The final messages revealed the true source of his sudden interest, references to financial planning, family wealth management, and the need to discuss my situation. Andrea called 3 times, leaving voicemails that oozed insincerity. Her carefully constructed apology never actually acknowledged wrongdoing but emphasized how important family connection was to her. The transparent attempt to access my newly revealed wealth was almost amusing in its predictability. That morning I drove to the phone store and changed my number. The young technician asked if I wanted to transfer my contacts to my new account. I declined, realizing there were only a handful of people I truly wanted to remain connected to, and my son was no longer among them. 2 days later, I met with Robert Kensington, my longtime attorney who had handled the sale of my business. Though normally reserved, even Robert seemed shocked when I explained what had happened at the restaurant. We spent 3 hours updating my will and establishing new trusts. I removed James as the primary beneficiary of my estate. Instead, I created trust funds for Emma and Tyler that would become accessible when they turned 25, old enough to have developed their own values separate from their parents' influence. Each trust included a letter explaining my hopes for them and the values I had tried to uphold in my life. A substantial portion of my wealth was directed to a new scholarship fund for working-class students pursuing construction and skilled trades education. I named it after Dorothy, who had always believed in helping others rise through education and hard work. The changes to my estate plan felt like reclaiming control of my legacy. James had rejected the values I had lived by, but perhaps my grandchildren, or these scholarship recipients, would carry them forward in ways he had not. With the legal matters settled, I focused on rebuilding my social connections. Years of working long hours, and then the gradual isolation as James pulled away, had left my friendship circle small. I reached out to Harold and a few other former employees who had become friends during our years working together. Harold and his wife Mary invited me for Sunday dinner, something I hadn't experienced since Dorothy passed. Sitting at their kitchen table, eating homemade pot roast, and discussing everything from politics to baseball, I felt a warmth I had been missing. These were people who valued me for myself, who had known me before wealth, and would have treated me the same without it. Despite these positive steps, I fell into a period of depression in the weeks following the restaurant incident. I would wake up at night reliving the moment James told me to wait outside, the laughter of strangers echoing in my memory. I questioned every parenting decision I had made, wondering where I had gone wrong. Had I given him too much? Not enough guidance? Had Dorothy's death left a void I failed to fill? The turning point in my healing came unexpectedly. I saw a flyer at the local hardware store seeking volunteers for a community center program teaching basic woodworking to teenagers. Without overthinking it, I wrote down my contact information. The next week, I found myself in a poorly equipped workshop behind the community center, showing 6 teenagers how to safely use a handsaw. Those kids changed everything for me. They arrived with various levels of interest, some clearly there only because the program kept them out of trouble after school. But they listened when I spoke, asked questions without judgment, and showed genuine appreciation when I helped them create something with their hands. One boy, Marcus, reminded me of James at 16. Bright but restless, unsure of his place in the world. He struggled with the first simple project, a small jewelry box. After breaking 2 pieces of wood through impatience, he was ready to quit. I sat with him, showed him how to measure twice and cut once, how to feel the grain of the wood, how to respect the material and the process. The pride on his face when he completed the box was a healing balm for my battered spirit. Weeks turned into months as I found new purpose in this volunteer work. I began bringing in better tools from my home workshop, upgrading the community center's equipment with anonymous donations. The program expanded from 1 afternoon to 3 as word spread about the old construction guy teaching useful skills. 4 months after the restaurant incident, a letter arrived addressed in childish handwriting. Inside was a drawing of a man with gray hair surrounded by tools, labeled Grandpa the Builder in Emma's careful printing. A smaller note in different handwriting read, "I want to build things like Grandpa when I grow up. Love, Tyler." The letter contained no return address, and I suspected it had been sent secretly, perhaps with the help of a school friend's parent. The simple acknowledgement from my grandchildren brought both joy and sorrow. They remembered me, thought of me, but were being raised in a household where materialism and social climbing were the primary values. James's attempts to reconnect became increasingly desperate as weeks passed without response from me. He showed up at my house twice, but I refused to answer the door. He sent registered letters that I returned unopened. When he finally cornered me in the grocery store parking lot, his first questions were about my financial advisors and estate planning, confirming that reconciliation was not his primary motivation. Andrea appeared unannounced one Sunday afternoon, dressed casually in a way I had never seen before, clearly an attempt to appear more down to earth. I spoke to her briefly on the porch, declining her invitation to lunch. Her practiced speech about family bonds and misunderstandings rang hollow after years of subtle and not-so-subtle dismissal of my place in their lives. When she mentioned a private school fundraiser they were chairing, suggesting I might want to contribute, I simply turned and went back inside. As my volunteer work expanded, I began renovating my home as a form of therapy, not to make it fancier or more impressive, but to create spaces that reflected my authentic self. I converted James's old bedroom into a reading nook filled with books Dorothy had loved. I expanded my workshop to accommodate small classes for neighborhood kids interested in learning woodworking. With each change, each new connection, each day spent in meaningful activity, rather than longing for my son's approval, I began to find peace. The renovation became a metaphor for my life, keeping the solid foundation while reshaping the interior to better serve my current needs and values. By the one-year anniversary of the restaurant incident, I had established a small mentoring program through the community center, pairing experienced tradespeople with young people interested in hands-on careers. We provided not just skills training, but guidance on starting small businesses, securing apprenticeships, and building professional reputations based on quality work and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had finally found my purpose in sharing the very working-class skills and values that James had rejected. Every time I helped a young person see the dignity in skilled labor, I felt a small healing of the wound my son had created. I couldn't change James's values, but I could ensure those values didn't die with my generation. 1 year and 3 months after that fateful dinner, my life had transformed in ways I never could have predicted. The community workshop program had grown to serve over 60 young people, with a waiting list twice that long. Former construction colleagues had joined as volunteer instructors, creating a vibrant community of mentorship and skill sharing. I had formed genuine friendships with people who knew my financial situation, but cared about me for my character and contributions. Tuesday night poker games with Harold and 3 other retired builders became a weekly ritual I looked forward to. Sarah, the community center director, became a trusted friend who shared my vision for empowering young people through practical skills. The isolation that had once felt crushing had been replaced by meaningful connection. My days had purpose beyond accumulating wealth or possessions. At 69, I felt more authentic and at peace than I had since Dorothy passed. On a warm Saturday in July, I was helping a group of teenagers build birdhouses for a community garden when I looked up to see Emma and Tyler standing hesitantly at the workshop door. A woman I didn't recognize waited a respectful distance behind them. My heart nearly stopped at the sight of my grandchildren, now looking older and taller than when I'd last seen them. Emma, approaching 11, had Dorothy's thoughtful eyes. 10-year-old Tyler had my square jaw and serious expression. "Grandpa?" Emma said tentatively, as if unsure of her welcome. I set down my tools and knelt to their level, opening my arms. They rushed forward, colliding into me with the unrestrained enthusiasm of children. The smell of their hair, the feeling of their small arms around my neck, broke something open inside me that I had carefully walled off. Later, over ice cream cones in my backyard, they explained that their friend Zoe's mother had brought them. They had been asking about me for months, and when they learned I was teaching woodworking near their summer day camp, they had begged for a chance to visit. Emma spoke softly about missing me, about keeping the wooden toys I had made years ago hidden in her closet because Mom doesn't like them in the room. Tyler proudly showed me calluses on his hands from the junior woodworking set he had received for his birthday, purchased with his own saved allowance. Through careful, gentle questioning, I learned that James and Andrea had separated 3 months earlier. James had moved into a downtown apartment while Andrea remained in the Oakwood Estates house with the children. Emma described tension, arguments about money, and her father's increasingly erratic behavior at home before the separation. "Dad cries sometimes," Tyler said matter-of-factly, digging into his second scoop of ice cream. "He looks at old pictures and gets sad." This revelation shook me deeply. The image of my son, who had worked so hard to project perfect control and success, breaking down alone in an apartment, was difficult to reconcile with the man who had humiliated me at the restaurant. Was it possible that losing his marriage and comfortable life had led to genuine reflection? After the children left, promising to visit again through their friend's mother, I spent days wrestling with conflicting emotions. The father in me wanted to reach out to James, to offer comfort despite everything. The wounded man in me remembered all too clearly the public rejection and years of increasing disdain. After much soul-searching, I wrote James a letter. Not an email or text that could be quickly fired off and just as quickly dismissed, but a handwritten letter on the stationery Dorothy had always kept in her desk. I invited him to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I made it clear this was not automatic forgiveness or financial support, but an opportunity to speak honestly as two adults. James arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, according to the barista. When I walked in, I barely recognized my son. Gone was the perfectly groomed executive in designer clothes. This James looked tired, humbled, his expensive watch replaced by a plain leather band, his tailored suit exchanged for jeans and a button-down shirt. We sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence before James spoke first, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how to begin apologizing for what I did to you. Not just at the restaurant, but for years before that." "Why did you do it?" I asked. The question that had haunted me for over a year. James stared into his coffee for a long moment. I became addicted to status, to being seen as successful. Andrea's family, her friends, my colleagues, they all measured worth by possessions and connections. Somewhere along the way, I started believing that was real value. He looked up, meeting my eyes. I was ashamed of where I came from, which meant I was ashamed of you. It's the most shameful thing I've ever done. Over the next 2 hours, we talked more honestly than we had in a decade. James described the gradual erosion of his values, how each compromise led to another until he couldn't recognize himself. He spoke about his marriage imploding when Andrea's family lost much of their wealth in a failed business venture, revealing that their relationship had always been transactional rather than loving. "The night after the restaurant, when I realized what I had done to you, something broke in me," James admitted. "I looked in the mirror and saw someone my mother would have been ashamed of. Someone you spent a lifetime trying to prevent me from becoming." I didn't offer easy absolution. I told James plainly how deeply his actions had hurt me, how they had called into question everything I thought we shared. I explained the changes I had made in my life, the community I had built, the purpose I had found that had nothing to do with him or his approval. "I can't just welcome you back as if nothing happened," I told him firmly. "Trust is rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions, not words or promises. If you want a relationship with me, it will be on new terms, with clear boundaries and expectations about respect." James nodded, accepting these terms without argument, another sign that perhaps something had genuinely changed in him. We agreed to begin with small steps, a weekly phone call, occasional coffee meetings, gradual rebuilding of connection based on authentic interaction rather than financial interest. Over the following months, our relationship slowly transformed. James began volunteering at the community workshop on Saturday mornings, initially working in the background, sweeping up sawdust and organizing tools. The teenagers were suspicious of this quiet man in expensive shoes, but James patiently earned their respect by showing up consistently and learning alongside them without pretension. 6 months after our coffee shop meeting, I invited James to Sunday dinner at my home, the first time he had been inside since before the restaurant incident. He arrived carrying groceries, insisting on helping cook rather than being served. As we worked side by side in the kitchen Dorothy had loved, I caught glimpses of the son I had raised, the person who existed before ambition and materialism had warped his values. Emma and Tyler began regular weekend visits, their faces lighting up when they entered my workshop. Emma showed a natural talent for detailed finishing work, patiently sanding wood until it felt like silk. Tyler preferred larger projects, throwing himself enthusiastically into building a treehouse in my backyard with his father's help. Watching James teach Tyler to measure and cut, patiently correcting mistakes without criticism, I saw healing happening across generations. The values I had tried to instill were flickering back to life, tested by fire but not extinguished. Our family dinners became a new tradition, held at my modest home rather than expensive restaurants. No fine wines or imported delicacies, just honest food and real conversation. James would arrive early to help cook, sometimes bringing a colleague or friend who needed the warmth of family connection. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching fireflies while the children played in the yard, James turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing this forever," he said quietly. "Not your money, but this. Family, belonging, real connection." "We almost did lose it," I acknowledged, not softening the truth. Sometimes the things that hurt us most are the very things that save us, if we're willing to learn from them. That restaurant incident, painful as it was, had forced both of us to confront essential truths. For me, it was recognizing that I deserved respect and had the strength to demand it. For James, it was seeing how far he had strayed from the values that truly matter and finding his way back to authenticity. I don't know what the future holds for our family. Healing is not a straight line but a winding path with occasional setbacks. James still struggles with habits formed during his years of status seeking. I still have moments of doubt when old wounds feel fresh, but we are moving forward with clear eyes and honest hearts. If you've stayed with me through this story, perhaps you've recognized elements of your own family dynamics, your own struggles with authentic connection in a world that often values appearance over substance. Maybe you've felt the pain of rejection or the temptation to compromise your values for acceptance. I hope my experience offers something useful, some reminder that it's never too late to stand up for your worth, to rebuild what matters, to find purpose beyond others' approval. The most valuable legacy isn't money or status, but the example we set for future generations. Have you ever had to draw a boundary with someone you love? How did you balance self-respect with forgiveness? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more reflections from a life of lessons learned the hard way. Thank you for listening. And remember, true wealth isn't what's in your wallet, but what remains when all the money is gone.